So we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Close Canada's Guantanamo Bay, International Voices Join MPs and Calling for Repatriation from Syria. My name is Tim McSorley, and I'm the National Coordinator of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. I'm honored that we are hosting this morning's event. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I'm joining you is the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. We pay respect to the Anishinaabe Algonquin people who are the original guardians of this land, and we thank them for their stewardship of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call this land home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. We welcome the resistance and resurgence of Indigenous peoples as part of the decolonizing process. This morning, we have an incredible lineup of speakers, including Canadian members of Parliament, renowned Canadian and international human rights activists, people with lived experience of indefinite detention and torture, and the family members of individuals, including Canadians, who remain detained in northeastern Syria. Before I introduce them, I want to share a few remarks about why we are here today. For more than 5 years, more than 40 Canadians, including 24 children, have been detained in northeastern Syria in deplorable life-threatening conditions. Conditions have been described as cruel and inhumane, and that amount to torture. The Canadian government is aware of this, but has done nothing. Actually, that's not true. The government has actually adopted policies that serve to justify leaving these Canadians in limbo, that justify its heartless and rights-violating lack of action. This Sunday, June 26th, is the International Day of Remembrance for the Victims of Torture. Canada is a proud signatory of the Convention Against Torture. Canada has celebrated its lead role in developing a global declaration against arbitrary detention. Despite all this, though, it has refused to end the arbitrary detention of 44 of its citizens held by Canada's allies in northeastern Syria. It's hypocritical, it's inhumane, and it undermines Canada's championing of human rights on the world stage. The ICMG is proud to join other organizations, including those here today, but also Human Rights Watch Canada, over half a dozen UN Special Rapporteurs and others in calling on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly, and the entire Canadian government to repatriate these Canadians now. As you will hear today, it is just, it is doable, and has already been done successfully by dozens of countries. Without further ado, I'm happy to introduce our speakers who will each give a 3 to 5 minute presentation. We'll then take questions from journalists and then turn to the general audience. Just to be clear, we won't be tolerating any questions or comments that are racist, sexist, or otherwise hateful. If that arises, we will be removing people from the meeting. So on to our speakers. I'll introduce them all in order and then we'll go one by one. We'll be starting with Monia Mazigh, human rights activist, author, and academic. We'll then be hearing from Heather McPherson, NDP MP and foreign affairs critic. Elizabeth May, Green Party MP, Mozzam Begg, former Guantanamo Bay detainee and outreach director of CAGE UK, Clive Stafford Smith, human rights lawyer who was one of the first lawyers into Guantanamo 20 years ago and co-founder of Reprieve, Natascha Mikkelsen, Repatriate the Children from Denmark, Sally Lane, author and mother of Jack Letts, detainee in Syria, Taha Ghayyur, Justice for All, Matthew Behrens from Stop Canadian Involvement in Torture, and Nafisa Mohammed, attorney and former senator of Trinidad and Tobago, who is currently suing her government for the repatriation of citizens. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Monia.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Tim, for hosting this important event. Thank you for everyone who joined us. Our MPs, our friends from human rights activism all over the world. Today, it is with great sadness that I joined this international press conference to stand in solidarity with families who are left out by the Canadian government in ignoring their pleas to bring their loved one from northern Syria prison home. Why is this Canadian government doing nothing to bring back its own citizen home? Worse, why is Canada putting obstacles for families of Canadians who are trying to bring their loved one back home. Where is Madame Melanie Joly, Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister? Why doesn't she stand up for the rights of Canadian children as she is doing so strongly with other children, like in Ukraine, for example? 20 years ago, my husband, Meher Arar, who was also detained in Syria, faced similar sort of behavior from the Canadian government. He was never charged with any crime, and still the Canadian government did not help him to come back home. And similarly, they put all the obstacles to stop his repatriation. If it was not for the will, determination, activism of people like you who are attending today here, my husband would have died in his Syrian prison. In the last 20 years, Canadian Muslims have been surveilled, spied upon, harassed in their workplace, on campuses, put under house arrest, had to wear electronic bracelets in their ankles to watch their movement, rendered to torture, kept for more than 10 years in Guantanamo, and sent to prison to disappear. Canadian legislation was brought to criminalize Canadian Muslims. Very few courageous politicians and engaged citizens stood up against this systemic Islamophobia. Today, we have a government who claims that it's committed to fighting Islamophobia, but at the same time, we have a government that does nothing to bring Muslim Canadian children, women, and men back home. So how can we still trust their commitment when they speak, obviously, with both sides of their mouth? Today, we have 44 Muslim Canadians detained in northern Syria. They were never charged with any crimes. Their Canadian families want them home, but the Canadian government is stopping them. Remember this quote: a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, and you devalue the citizenship of every Canadian in this place and in this country when you break down and make it conditional for anyone. This quote has been said by our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Today, it is imperative that Prime Minister Trudeau respects his promise and principles. It is time for him and his government to listen to the demands of Kurdish forces in northern Syria and repatriate all the Canadian detained in those horrible camps. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monia. And now we will be going to a video from NDP MP and Foreign Affairs critic, Heather McPherson.
Today, I'm urging the Government of Canada to take responsibility for Canadians arbitrarily detained in Syria. A number of Canadians, including many young children, are being detained unlawfully in northeast Syria in the most deplorable conditions. We know the conditions in these camps are the worst observers have seen. There is no medical care, there is malnutrition, there is violence, there is abuse. Canadian children are growing up in these conditions. Canadians held detained in prisons without trial have alleged torture. They are barely surviving in life-threatening conditions with no end in sight. 1 year ago, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development studied this issue. We heard from many expert witnesses, and in our report, we urged Canada to pursue all options possible to repatriate the Canadian children in northeast Syria. We found, and I quote, the current policy of leaving children in indefinite detention to punish them for crimes of others and to hide behind the complexity of sorting the innocent from the guilty in order to justify doing nothing is immoral and un-Canadian. It has been 1 year since the committee issued that report. In that year, the Canadian government has refused to act. This government continues to say it cannot access those Canadians, but that is clearly untrue. Other countries have accessed and repatriated their citizens. The United Nations Special Rapporteurs have urged Canada to repatriate its citizens. Canadians should not have to go to court to get the consular services that they deserve. Families should not have to sue this government to get help. I believe this government is afraid to act. They are afraid to take responsibility for some of these adults who may present very complex cases. This problem is a challenging one, yes, but it is not one where the government can look away. A government cannot evade its responsibilities towards its citizens, and it must not make decisions based on fear. All Canadians in Northeast Syria need to be repatriated, reintegrated, and resettled in Canada. And anyone who may have committed crimes should be prosecuted here under our judicial system. Other countries have done this, but Canada has not yet shown the political will. My message to the government of Canada is this: Canadians are Canadians. There can be no excuse to treat some Canadian citizens differently than others. Uphold human rights, uphold the rule of law, take responsibility for our citizens.
Thank you to Heather McPherson for sharing that message with us today. And next we'll move on to Elizabeth May, MP for the Green Party.
Thank you very much. And it's an honor to be with you all. And especially, it's always for me really emotional to be with Sally. I can't begin to imagine as a mother myself. And I know the pain and the horrors that she's gone through to have her son in a place where he's so unsafe. And as the words that Heather McPherson just spoke, I completely agree with every syllable. I am baffled what we have gone to great lengths to repatriate Canadians, including a child, in the very same circumstances. And yet we're allowing 44 Canadians, most of them children, to remain in conditions which are essentially, there's no words for it. I mean, Monia has spoken to what it was like when her husband was in prison in Syria. And by the way, Monia, I remember going to meet with the then Solicitor General, who darkly told me, oh, there's all kinds of things we can't tell you about. There's much more evidence than you know. Oh, really? There was nothing. And there's nothing. These Canadians have never been charged with anything. They've never been convicted of anything. How could 23 children, in any case, have been charged or convicted of anything? But the 8 men and 13 women and 23 Canadian children have never been charged with anything, have never been convicted of anything, but remain in conditions which, as I said, are heart-wrenching for anyone who considers this as a parent or as a grandmother. How can we turn our backs on these Canadians? How can we've not provided consular services? We say it's too tricky to get in there. None of the excuses are other than paper thin, and they speak to cowardice. I can't understand why we are not acting to rescue urgently and repatriate all of the Canadians being held in Syria. I know we have many voices to be heard on this issue, so I'll stop there. But I'm very grateful for the members of the media that are here. I've presented the petition on behalf of hundreds of Canadians who share this position that we need to repatriate Canadians being held in Syria because they're not safe. I emphasize that. It's not like they're somewhere safe. They're not safe. They have to be rescued, and they have to be rescued now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. May. And now we'll move on to Mozzam Begg. Oh, sorry, you're muted. Still muted. Hold on 1 second.
Okay.
Oh,
thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon from here in sunny Birmingham. My name is Mozzam Begg. I'm a former Guantanamo prisoner held there without charge or trial by the US in Bagram and the US and Guantanamo for 3 years. This began with Monia speaking about the case of her husband, Mahar Arar. And I first heard about Mahar Arar not his name, but the person that was held and renditioned by the US to Syria by American interrogators in Bagram, where I saw 2 people murdered, 2 people beaten to death by American soldiers. And I was told that if I didn't cooperate with the Americans, that I too would be sent to Syria, where the Americans have already sent a Syrian, a person. I learned much later that this person was Mahar Arar. And why this is relevant is because when we're talking about Syria, and of course, all of these cases are connected to what happened in Syria quite directly. Many young men went to Syria to help to what they believe was removing the tyrannical, torturous regime of Bashar al-Assad. Much in the same way as many young men today are going to Ukraine from the West. The only difference is they're not getting targeted because they're Muslims. And in the case of many, although this barbarous organization, ISIS, emerged from this place, it's something that I know about because I was there too in 2012-13, and I met with many young men, including some who later went on to join ISIS, including some Canadians. But that was not the reason why they came in the beginning. And the reason was because of this regime that would put people into coffins while they're alive to try to extract information from them or to get them to agree with the regime. And many of these young men, many, were duped, lied to, and hoodwinked by this group called Islamic State. And I believe that Jack Letts and people like him were amongst them. I met a young man who was a soldier in the Dutch army. He joined, he thought he was fighting the regime, and soon enough he got lied to by ISIS and ended up joining them. When he realized what was happening to the Yazidis in particular, he tried to leave, but it was too late. They imprisoned him, he tried to escape once or twice, and then he was executed. Why this is relevant to me is because I know from speaking to particularly the family of Jack Letts, who's had his nationality revoked, his British nationality revoked. And that is important because in Britain, we are unfortunately a step ahead of Canada in doing, in working against the rights of our citizens. Not only will we abandon them, we'll abandon them by saying they are no longer citizens of this country. And for the most part, the majority of those people who've had their nationalities revoked, who are sitting in Syria, are people who hail from Asia and Africa. They're darker skinned like me. So it's easier to say they're not really British. And most people have said that this was kind of a racist law, except for the case of Jack Letts, who is a dual Canadian and British citizen. And in his case, his British citizenship was removed. His parents were from Oxford. Father's an organic farmer. And how could it be then that this white indigenous, quote unquote, young man has had his nationality revoked? And the answer is, of course, Islamophobia. Is because in addition to everything else, he's a Muslim. So now he's left to, the only place he can turn to is Canada. And in Canada, there is hope, where Britain removed all of that hope on the day when his nationality was removed. So I just want to end by saying this, that as somebody who's a former prisoner of the United States in Guantanamo, who's been subjected to some of the worst torture, you'll be hearing from my lawyer in a moment, I've come to learn that the conditions in the camps in northern Syria, I believe, are worse than what we experienced, and they were pretty bad to begin with. And the other thing I would say is that how is it possible that Britain, Canada, and many of these other states who've shirked their responsibilities towards their citizens cannot do what countries like Uzbekistan, Kosovo, and Russia have done, and that is to repatriate their own citizens? Goodness knows those countries, some of them have terrible human rights records, but at least when it comes to their citizens, they know where their priorities are. So I'm just going to end there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Begg, and thanks so much for being here with us today and sharing those powerful words. We're going to now move on to Clive Stafford Smith.
Well, thank you very much. I am indeed Mozzam's lawyer. It's a great privilege to be able to say that. And look at Mozzam. Let's face it, when people try to terrify you about the people in Syria, Mozzam, you'll forgive me if I say the very worst they come up with is you, Mozzam. You know, they don't at least have pictures of your children to show, which is what the vast majority of prisoners in Syria are. We call it Guantanamo on the Euphrates for good reason, because it is very much like Guantanamo Bay. And I was privileged to bring the first lawsuit against Guantanamo. And as of today, the comparisons are very stark. We've had 780 prisoners in Guantanamo, 78,000 prisoners in Guantanamo on the Euphrates. And if you think everyone's a bad person, just look at Guantanamo. We have so far liberated 752 of the prisoners in Guantanamo. 9 people have died. And that means that we have proven under the United States' own rules that at least 97.6% of the people that they said were the worst of the worst terrorists in the world were not. Because in order to be released from Guantanamo, you have to have all 6 of the top American intelligence agencies say you're no threat to anyone. But then in Guantanamo, you know, at least they could say they were all men and they might genuinely have been fighting about people. It turned out to be nonsense, of course. But of the people down in Syria, the large majority are children. So they can't possibly say that about them. We talk about conditions. The conditions at Guantanamo have been deplorable. They are nothing like as bad in Guantanamo as in Northeast Syria. I've been to the camps in Northeast Syria 5 times myself, and it's just horrendous. And you've got children dying, and I've got videos of children dying. I've got videos of children being burned in their tents in these deplorable conditions there. And look, I know I'm American, but I'm a dual national and I'm British as well. And it is extraordinary to me that Donald Trump said that we should all take back our nationals and close the camps in Syria. When did you ever hear Donald Trump being right and everyone else being wrong? It's truly extraordinary. It's not something I say as an American very often. But I'll say this, the British tend to be the bad guys in this whole scenario. And on one of my first trips to Syria, the Canadian government had made arrangements to bring the Canadians back. They had got passport applications from the people who didn't have passports. I met with a bunch of the Canadian women, and I met with Jack Letts, who had gone through this process of filling out passport applications so the Canadians could bring them back. And they've negotiated with the Syrians to get the people back. Then suddenly they stopped the process. And that was because the mother country, being paternalistic, Britain had told the Canadians, the Australians, and all the other Europeans that we just didn't want these dreadful terrorists back. And, you know, that's just despicable. It's despicable that Britain did that. But actually, it's kind of pathetic that the Canadians went along with it when they were about to do the right thing. And you need to hold your government to account for doing that. And I've got the documentary proof. If you want it, just let me know and I'll give it to you. When you look at the people there, yes, there are lots of children and it's not hard to get people out. The Canadians come up with all this nonsense about how difficult it is. I personally have got 24 people out and it's not very difficult. And the difference between the US and the Northeast Syrians is they want to get rid of the prisoners, whereas in the early days of Guantanamo, the US didn't. So you are pushing at an open door there if only the government makes the right request. You then have a series of the women there, many of whom suffer from significant mental disorders that are being exacerbated by where they are. But then you have the men, and people don't even talk about the men. Well, let's just look at the Guantanamo men. So we've proven 97% of them weren't out to murder you in your bed. And there were people who, as Mozzam said, had been misled into going to Syria for stupid reasons. They get there, like Jack. Jack Letts got prosecuted by the ISIS mad people 3 times. He's very lucky he talked his way out of being killed while he was there. And then his mum and dad try to get him back, and the British prosecute them. I'm a father. If my son was in Syria, I would parachute in there to get him out. And leaving Jack, I met with Jack in one of their little secret prisons there in Syria. He's a nice lad. I've met him. The people who say bad things about him haven't met him. Obviously, Sally will talk, and she sure met him. She gave birth to him. But she's his mother, and to the extent that they say she's biased, I'm on her side, and I'm not biased. I met Jack. He's a really decent kid, and he needs to come back to Canada as soon as we can make it happen. So please put the pressure on your government to do the right thing. Ignore the British misbehaving. Who would go along with Priti Patel, for goodness sake? And let's get these folk back home. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stafford Smith. And we will now hear from Natascha Mikkelsen.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for hosting this event. I will be talking about the repatriation of some of the Danish citizens. In Denmark, we have repatriated 16 children and 3 women from the prison camps in northeast Syria, a 13-year-old injured boy and an orphan in 2019, as well as 14 children and 3 women in October 2021. And some of the children who came home had been in prison camps for more than 3 and 4 years before the Danish government decided to repatriate them. I first met them in northeast Syria in 2019, where I traveled as a journalist, and it was terrible to see the conditions that these children were staying in, and the women. And one of the children that I interviewed, a 10-year-old boy, was very affected by the situation. He was scared and crying and saying that he didn't like to be in the prison camp. And since my first meeting with this boy, and after following the case of a Danish orphan, I decided to form RTC Denmark. I felt it was terrible to meet innocent children locked up in one of the worst places on earth and not being able to help them simply because our government doesn't like their parents. If they wanted to, they could help them easily and bring them home. In May last year, the Danish government was under extreme pressure to bring home the children, and then they decided to evacuate 14 children and their 3 mothers who arrived to Denmark in October last year. Now, when I see the children that were repatriated last year, I see very different children than the ones I met in the prison camps. In the prison camps, they were sick and they were afraid all the time. They weren't allowed to be children. Now, when I see them, they are children the way that children are supposed to be. They are, of course, affected by the traumas from their life in the camps for so many years. And they are physically and mentally scarred from living in a war zone. Also, they are dealing with the pain of being separated from their mothers who have been in prison since their return to Denmark. But they are playing and they don't have to be afraid anymore. Yesterday, I spent time with the same young boy that I met for the first time almost 3 years ago. And he and his siblings are now playing soccer, they are bicycling and living a secure life like all other Danish children. For me, it's amazing to see them finally being allowed to be children and have the childhood that they deserve. 5 Danish children are still left behind in the Syrian prison camps because their mothers have had their Danish citizenships revoked. They were while they were locked up in Syria. The children, they are in a terrible health condition and need to be repatriated like the other Danish children with their mothers as soon as possible. It is unfortunately only a matter of time before it's too late. I just saw them here a month ago in May, and they are in a terrible situation in the camps. So in our organization, we will continue to follow the children that came home and make sure that they get the right help. And we will continue to fight for the last 5 Danish children to come home to Denmark as well. My hope is that all the children in the prison camps will get their chance for a better life and that their adults will come home as well so that they can get a fair trial. So yeah, this was short version of the Danish people from the prison camps in northeast Syria who were repatriated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mikkelsen. And now we'll hear from Taha Ghayer from Justice for All.
Good morning. Thank you for everyone's very heartfelt statements here today. Arbitrary detention violates established principles of human rights, the rule of law, and independence of judiciary. This is what the Global Affairs Canada stated in February 2021, when Canada proudly launched the Declaration Against the Arbitrary Detention in the State-to-State Relations, signed by 68 countries, which was a historic achievement for global human rights. However, Canada has blatantly ignored its own citizens arbitrarily detained in subhuman conditions in northeast Syria, as we know, for over 3 years. Justice for All Canada denounces the inaction of the Canadian government and Global Affairs Canada regarding the Canadian citizens detained indefinitely in Syria by Kurdish authorities in degrading and life-threatening conditions, as we have heard. Particularly disturbing, of course, is the fact that more than half of the detained Canadians are children, and many under age 7. This inhumane situation is among our darkest days of Canadian history. It is Canada's Guantanamo Bay period. It is a stain on our proud democratic ideals. We have forsaken our own citizens to a merciless fate on the flimsy premise of a security risk, which has never been proven. Access to consular services, at the very least, is a right, not a privilege afforded to only certain citizens. Kurdish-led authorities have repeatedly urged home countries to repatriate their nationals. Canada has only allowed 3 of the detained citizens to return home, while 25 other countries, including our allies, the US, Germany, Denmark, as we've heard, have repatriated their own citizens from the very same camps where people are dying. It is appalling that we cannot do the same. The only explanation is systemic Islamophobia. Let us remember, none of these Canadians trapped in Syria have been brought before judicial authority. This is a severe violation of international conventions which grant everyone the right to return to their country of nationality. In January 2021, Global Affairs Canada and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs adopted a policy framework that allows Canada to consider repatriation of its nationals held in northeast Syria on a case-by-case basis under certain conditions. This policy framework was never announced publicly. So today, we urge Global Affairs Canada to share its policy framework with human rights advocacy groups working to repatriate these arbitrarily detained citizens and prisoners. We call upon Canadian government to urgently establish full access to consular services to all Canadian detainees in the war zone. We urge the Canadian government to begin correspondence with Kurdish authorities for immediate repatriation of Canadian citizens from northeast Syria. Our continued unresponsive and irresponsible handling of the Canadian Muslim detainees indicates that Canada has tiers of citizenship. Muslim and minority ethnic Canadians are second-class citizens and do not hold the same value. In a nation that proudly showcases its diversity, these double standards are shocking, to say the least. Did Prime Minister Trudeau not truly mean what he said during his 2015 election campaign, that a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian? Canada's apathy towards its vulnerable citizens, particularly children and youth, is deeply disturbing. We have failed these Canadian Muslim individuals and families. They are Canadian citizens and have every right to return to Canada according to Canadian and international human rights conventions. Global Affairs Canada must make it a priority to shut down its Guantanamo Bay now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ghayer. And now we'll go to Sally Lane.
Thank you. In contrast to other European countries such as Denmark, Canada has achieved almost nothing in terms of repatriating its citizens from Syria, and in fact stands at the bottom of a league table of repatriations of men, women and children alongside other dismal performers of Britain, Australia and France. Countries such as The US, Germany, Netherlands, Albania, Sweden, Finland, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan have all repatriated many, if not all, of their citizens. Just 2 days ago, Belgium repatriated 16 children and 6 women. Canadian women and children in the camp have had to watch as their fellow inmates leave for their home countries, wondering when it's going to be their turn. This state of affairs begs the question, why can't Canada, a well-resourced country that prides itself on promoting human rights around the world, repatriate its own citizens from torture camps and prisons in Syria? 5 years ago, in July 2017, the Canadian government told me and my husband John it was doing everything it could to secure the release of our son Jack from prison in Syria. Additionally, they were very concerned about Jack's reports about his mistreatment while in detention. In the period since these comforting words, the Canadian government has done precisely nothing to fulfill its promises and has, in fact, given us excuse after excuse as to why they are unable to free Jack and the other 43 Canadians from arbitrary detention. Inexplicably, Global Affairs Canada has now made the decision to fight in court all the Canadian families of detainees to ensure that our loved ones are kept in their current appalling conditions, which, if they were applied to an animal in Canada, would be grounds for a 5-year sentence in animal cruelty. Jack and the other Canadians are victims of trial by media, subject to lurid headlines and dangerous and misleading labels. The televised interviews that Jack and other high-profile detainees have given, which are sometimes presented as evidence, are the fruit of coercion. And the same journalists who conducted these interviews have declared in the context of Ukraine that interviewing prisoners while in detention is unethical and illegal. Before Jack was detained in 2017, he sent me reams of messages detailing his opposition to ISIS and his imprisonment by them. He explained that his Kurdish detainers had their own spies in Raqqa and knew that he was one of the good guys. I have since been in contact with female camp inmates who've told me that they were also imprisoned by ISIS for long periods of time, where they were severely abused by the terror group. These detainees, male and female, are thus being doubly punished, first by ISIS and now by the current Kurdish administration in Syria, which is imprisoning them. I've had no direct contact with Jack since July 8, 2017. I haven't seen him since he was 18. He's now 26. He's being held without access to the outside world, apart from via a handful of Red Cross letters, which are heavily censored of all mention of conditions. He's been denied access to a lawyer for his case and is forbidden to sign anything. He's been refused visits by international NGOs who have attempted to access him. The Canadian government says it has received no information from the men's prison since 2019, even though the Kurdish detainers are their allies. When I asked Global Affairs Canada if I would be informed if Jack were no longer alive, they replied that they couldn't guarantee this would be the case. John and I have been campaigning for 8 years now to bring our son back. Our task has been made even more difficult by the fact that we were charged by the British government for sending money to Jack to help him escape while he was being hunted by ISIS. The grounds for our charge were that any money to Syria is seen as potentially money for terrorism. This despite the fact the British police could find no evidence Jack had joined ISIS and that the judge in our case said that there was no evidence our money had funded terrorism. Sadly, the people who pay the heaviest price for this ludicrous application of terrorism law, in which innocent parents trying to save their son are convicted as criminals, are those detainees still held in northeast Syria in filthy and degrading conditions, the men crammed into windowless cells in which 400 inmates died of TB in 1 year alone, and the women and children in camps that are filled with the stench of human waste. The Canada that is ensuring the continuation of this dreadful situation is not the Canada I grew up with. As a teenager, I sang the Canadian national anthem every morning, along with everyone else in my high school in Southern Ontario. Little did I know then that 40 years later, I would be pleading with the Canadian Prime Minister to secure the release of my son from a torture prison. All that any of the families are requesting is for Canada to respect the right of its citizens to stop breaking international law by detaining people indefinitely on no charge in deplorable conditions and to repatriate our loved ones before it is too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lane, for those powerful words. And we'll now move on to Matthew Behrens.
Thank you, Tim. It's a real honor to be on this panel this morning. A lot of people have talked about Canada's Guantanamo Bay. Let's talk about what Canada's Guantanamo looks like. There's no clean water or nutritious food. There's rarely diapers or sanitary towels. There's no medical care. There's no education. There's no privacy. There's no soft beds. There's no playgrounds. So where do the children play in these camps? They play next to cesspools of human waste. Some children have fallen into those cesspools. The sewage floods their tents. Wild dogs roam the camps, terrorizing the people who are there. Malnutrition is rampant. And as Clive said, children are killed, as are their mothers, in the all too common tent fires. One Canadian child's nutritional deficiency makes them crave salt and minerals, and so they eat sand and dirt. That's not a secret. This has been shared with Global Affairs Canada, yet Justin Trudeau, Melanie Joly, and Chrystia Freeland are behaving as if our so-called national security requires that Canadian child to eat sand and dirt and to die in the slow suffering of starvation. And as has been mentioned, hundreds are dying every year from preventable causes. In the men's prisons, there are bone-thin prisoners, many with amputated limbs, and many of those detainees remain in the same position from 8 a.m. until midnight because they're so tightly packed in with one overflowing latrine for 80 people. The Kurds who hold these Canadians have repeatedly told Ottawa, we will hand over your citizens if you send an official representative or a delegate from a humanitarian organization to receive them. We have the Americans who are ready to escort Canadians out. And yet Canada has invested $2.5 million to repatriate Iraqi nationals from these camps and prisons, yet it is spending millions in court to prevent the return of its own citizens. As Monia pointed out earlier, this is nothing new. We have seen over the past 20 years, Canada subcontracting the gross human rights violations of its own Muslim citizens and carving out a permanent state of exception for itself when it comes to enforcing discriminatory laws and practices and providing impunity for the agents of torture and arbitrary detention. These departments have names. They are called CSIS, the RCMP, Global Affairs, and yes, the Department of Justice itself. We're also extremely concerned that Canada, which is a nation built on the forced separation of Indigenous children from their families, may very well seek to forcibly separate the children in Syria from their Muslim mothers. That's what the unprecedented, discriminatory, none is too many global affairs policy framework preventing repatriation is all about. If you want your child to be free, you have to give them up so they will become quote unquote unaccompanied. That is the only way for a child to even be considered for repatriation. It's not even a guarantee, but it's a devil's bargain that is official Canadian policy, which reeks of a national shame. Our ultimate message to the families of the detainees and to the detainees themselves is long overdue. We recognize and honor your humanity as Canadian Muslims. We recognize your suffering and we seek to honor your rights. Those rights are universal and no government is allowed, even by their own laws, to violate them. Heather McPherson talked earlier about getting over our fears, which needless to say are rooted in racism and Islamophobia. But let's remember that there was no policy framework to prevent the repatriation of the two Michaels from their arbitrary detention in China. They were afforded a presumption of innocence, as well they should have been, that has never been extended to these 44 Canadians. The federal court has been very clear. In 2009, in the Abdel Razak repatriation case, they wrote, quote, "Charter rights are not dependent on the wisdom of the choices Canadians make, nor their moral character or political beliefs. Foolish persons have no lesser rights under the Charter than those who have made wise choices or are considered to be morally and politically upstanding." We're not here today to judge the detainees' choices. We are here to say that Canada must comply with the very laws it so often accuses others of violating. And we should stop treating 23 Canadian Muslim children, 13 women and 8 men, all of them tortured, emaciated souls, as our enemy. Martin Luther King addressed this very issue during the last year of his life, and I think we can take comfort from his wisdom and inspiration. Quote, "We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, and for those it calls enemy. For no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers and sisters. Our fellow citizens in Northeast Syria are not our enemies. They have a right under the law to return to Canada, and we need to bring them home." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Behrens, for those powerful words. And we'll now move on to Nafisa Mohammed.
A very pleasant good morning and assalamu alaikum to all persons on this link. I want to take the opportunity to thank the organizers for seeing it fit to have this level of discussions taking place with respect to this burning issue of the repatriation of citizens from the camps in Syria. In my own case, I am from the country Trinidad and Tobago, which is a twin island republic consisting of approximately 1.4 million people who, it's a very rich, diverse, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multicultural society. And we have had a history of colonization, a history of slavery, which was replaced by East Indian indentureship also. And given the dynamics in the society, it is my respectful view, and I want to take the opportunity to endorse a lot of what has been said by previous speakers, because it is heart-wrenching to hear about these conditions and the fact that in our case, we have been advocating for the repatriation of 72 children and 24 women. Most of the men who we understand who would have traveled to Syria during the period 2014, 15, and 16, most of the men have been killed. Whatever the push and pull factors are, the fact remains that there are these women and children who are existing under horrendous conditions in these camps in the northeastern part of Syria. And I have been an advocate here in my country, calling for the repatriation, the reunification, and the reintegration of our citizens. The excuse that we keep hearing is that they need to verify whether these children or these people are in fact citizens of the country. And these are mere excuses because there is documentation available, passport photos, passport information, identification. In fact, from the breakdown that we have had, approximately 33 of these children would have been born over there in Syria between 2015 and 2016 thereabouts. So you are looking at children below the age of 8 or even below the age of 7 years who do not even have the mental capacity to be accused of committing any crime, far less be engaged in acts of terrorism. You have approximately 56 of these children being under the age of 12, and the same principle applies. And with respect to the mothers are the ones who made the children. So this issue of wanting to verify whether these children are in fact citizens, the mothers, we have been engaged in dialogue with the relatives of these families, and a lot of data is now readily available and accessible. And as of this time, I know that a repatriation plan has been developed. The relatives have come together and signed an agreement. There is a social contract that has been developed with respect to collaborating with the authorities and particularly with law enforcement in an effort to repatriate these citizens. I keep saying this is not rocket science. Our Muslim community here in Trinidad and Tobago have evolved over the years. We are all patriots who love our country, but the fear factor, that Islamophobia, is so easy to invoke. And therefore, my advocacy is to call upon the authorities to let us work together, let us come together and collaborate to help to repatriate these citizens. There are avenues available. I heard this speaker, who the founder of the Reprieve movement. I know that 2-3 years ago, Reprieve was very involved in a repatriation that took place with 2 of our children who are very well reintegrated in our society. They are in school, they are doing very well. With respect to the current situation, We are saying that with a collaboration with law enforcement, you have to balance the human rights and humanitarian considerations. We have a very vibrant Muslim community. I have counted at least 10 geographical locations where these families come from. And in each of these locations, we have organizations, we have non-governmental organizations, we have, persons from the Muslim community who are readily available to help, to work with the state officials and other agencies of state. And what I find very concerning is the level of hypocrisy that is existing, because as a developing country, we have been upgrading and modernizing our laws. And in fact, as many of you would know, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is a convention that most countries have already signed and ratified. In light of our ratification of that convention way back in 1991, we have been upgrading and modernizing our child protection laws in the country. We now have a dedicated, specialized family and children division of the High Court. We now have a children's authority that is supposed to coordinate all activities involving children, and more so in the legislation that gave effect to these new institutions. It has been expressly stated that part of the objectives, for example, of the Children's Authority Act, it is stated in Section 3 that one of the objectives is to give effect to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that convention contains provisions, articles that deal with displaced persons. These are our citizens who are displaced, and therefore they need a certain measure of protection, not persecution. And they ought not to be criminalized unless the state has evidence to prove that any of these persons, these children or women, have committed some criminal act. Then we are just, continuing this barrier. And when we need to engage in dialogue to allay these fears and concerns, and it is my appeal for our law enforcement officials to be more ready to engage in a dialogue. The relatives have come together. There is much more accurate data that is available, and there is a continuous process. I want to say that I am not actively involved in the court proceedings, but the relatives have had to go to the High Court. There's a matter now on appeal, and there's a team of lawyers dealing with it from that legal perspective. But I am of the view that a lot of what we are talking about and we are experiencing is because of the narrative that is coming out of Western countries, and it's arising from those meetings with the G7, where countries all over the world, there are UN resolutions that have been passed, and they are, as a result of these resolutions and the types of frameworks that are being invoked and countries are being called upon to implement. It's a narrative that is unfounded and needs to be revisited, and we need to step up on our advocacy internationally to be able to get these major countries that are imposing and foisting these new laws and prescriptions for us to, and here in Trinidad and Tobago, I maintain the view that we have the ability, with our rich history and the contributions of the Muslim community towards developing the country, we can show a way forward towards a repatriation, a reunification with families, and a reintegration in society that can easily be followed elsewhere, because we have the capacity with that type of collaboration if it is allowed to happen. So I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I hope that this advocacy continues at the level so that regionally and internationally, a lot of these prescriptions can be revisited and let there be a review so that the Islamophobia and all this so-called terrorism, etc., can be dealt with, because, a lot of it is unfounded, and it is really, to me, emanating since 9/11 events, and we need to revisit it. Thank you for enabling me to say these few words on this panel.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mohammed, for joining us today and for those really powerful words. And thank you to all our speakers. We're now going to move on to questions. We'd invite any journalists who have questions to either raise their hands or put their questions in the chat to begin with, and then we'll move on to questions from the general audience. Also, if you're watching this on Facebook, my colleague will also be looking at the comment section on Facebook. So if you have any questions there as well, please share them. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions just yet. So if there's anybody else in the audience who would like to ask a question, please put it in the chat. Or we'll also, we have a few other questions that we'll ask our panelists to elaborate on as we go as well. Okay. Okay, we do have a question from somebody in the audience who has their hand up. I'd ask that you keep your question very brief so our panelists have a chance to answer. And if you have somebody you'd like to direct it to, please say who the question is for.
Hi, good morning. My name is Tazeen Hassan, and I am from Justice for All Canada. And I just want to ask that what was the last time when Canadian government was contacted or Global Affairs was contacted, and what was their response?
Okay, maybe I'll ask Matthew or Sally if they can speak to that question.
Yeah, I can answer that if you like. I suppose the process with GAC is complicated now by the fact that we are now meeting them in court. The irony of the situation is that we have been told to report our concerns about our relatives' conditions and the state of their health to GAC, which is the very department that is trying to prevent repatriation. We are engaging in that process. So we update Global Affairs Canada as to what information we have about our relatives. I have no information about Jack at all because there's been no access to the prisons. The relatives of the women and children have better access to information, so they're able to provide updates to Global Affairs. Global Affairs are doing nothing as far as I can tell in terms of this process, other than saying that we do not fit their repatriation criteria. The repatriation criteria are either you have to be an unaccompanied child. Well, there are no more unaccompanied children in Syria because the one orphan, Amira, was brought back 2 years ago. Or you have to become an unaccompanied child. In other words, the mothers have to agree to give them up. Or you have to prove that your relatives' conditions have deteriorated since the implementation of their secret repatriation policy. I say secret because they supposedly implemented the policy in January 2021, but our lawyer didn't find out about this policy until the court submission was submitted in November 2021. So in terms of proving that your relatives' conditions have deteriorated, you have to be able to have access to a medical assessment, which for Jack is impossible because the only NGO that accesses the prison are the Red Cross, and the Red Cross don't do medical assessments. And in fact, the Red Cross are not allowed to report on conditions at all for fear of jeopardizing their neutrality. So that's the situation we're now in. The court case is due to, court hearing is due to go ahead at the beginning of November. So that's our timeline.
Thank you very much, Sally. Next, I have a question for Mr. Begg, and that's a question just, we were asked if you could elaborate on the fact that Jack Letts, as far as we, as we understand it, opposed ISIS while he was in, while he was and remains in Syria.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really important one. One of the things that I said, first of all, about somebody that I knew who's a former Dutch soldier who joined ISIS and then regretted it and was executed by them. This is something that is deeply unexplored at the moment, and I think it needs to be given its due, particularly because, for example, let's just say the Nazis, Hitler, and so forth. There were many people from within the Wehrmacht, within the German forces, who tried to get rid of the Nazis themselves and were persecuted for it by the Nazis. And when they were caught by the Allies, some of them also were persecuted because they fought the Allies. So they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. But it takes a special kind of courage, in my view, to oppose an organization, knowing what they could do to you, knowing what they've done to other people. And this is what happened to my friend. His name was Yilmaz. He opposed them from within, from inside, as being part of the organization, and lost his life as a result. Having spoken to Jack's parents, having seen the messages, having seen his interviews with various media organizations after he's been held, Jack has said some things that could very much, I think, even now, put his life at great risk. He said, for example, I don't believe anybody should join the organization. I believe the organization should be fought. Now, to say that from outside is easy. To say that from a place where there could be numbers of them around you that could cause your death or impairment requires a special kind of bravery. And it's that part of this story that is deeply unexplored and has not been looked at. To be imprisoned by them repeatedly, to be tortured by them perhaps, to be threatened by them, is no easy fate within ISIS territory. And so imagine then a person like that, and Clive has visited him. You can see from his interviews, I mean, you can't know everything, but you can see he's a guy that is not lying. And he accepts that he was part of them for at least a short while, but he entirely, and correct me if I'm wrong if I say that, but he entirely opposed them. And so that resistance from within, in addition to everything else, even if you weren't resisting them from within, but you're there as the women and children are, through no fault of your own other than making perhaps a silly mistake, but silly mistakes aren't things that we imprison people for life for, surely. But that part of it, I think, is at some point, we're going to turn around once we know the story of people like Jack. And something that Sally has said is that there's probably more than half of the people that once they knew what ISIS was really about, opposed them. They'll never get to give their voices because of our suspicion has taken over us and clouded our judgment. And again, that will be to our eternal shame if we don't allow that to happen.
Mozzam, as your lawyer, I hate to correct you, but actually he's never said that he was part of ISIS. He was in Syria. But indeed, I talked to him at great length, and we have various documentation that he always opposed ISIS. And so I don't think there's any evidence that Jack was doing that. And indeed, he was arrested 3 times. He was locked up 3 times. He's quite glib, Jack. He's got a good tongue on him, and he talked his way out of it. But the great challenge when, John and Sally were trying to get him out of there, we could have easily forced the government's hand if we'd gone public and trashed them for not doing their job in Britain. And we couldn't do that because if we did, and if we published in the British media that Jack was trying to escape and John and Sally were trying to get him out, as we would have, I had all these bishops lined up. I had a bunch of actors and actresses, famous people willing to say, if it was my child, of course I'd do this. But if we went public, ISIS would find out about it and they would have killed them. So that's the only point I want to make, Mozzam, is I don't think he ever was sympathetic with ISIS as an organization, and he very nearly suffered exactly the same as your friend.
Thank you both for those really important answers, and just what you were saying, Mr. Begg, about the idea that we don't know, and that's at the heart of a lot of what we're trying to get at, is that these people are being held in indefinite detention. They have not been charged. We don't know what people did or didn't do, and yet they're being treated as suspicious and as criminals. And as so many people have pointed out today, the underlying link to this is the systemic Islamophobia that we see in these accusations. So
on that, Tim, can I just say on that? Yeah,
yeah,
I've spent my life defending people who are facing murder and death penalty cases. And, you know, when I talk to Jack, he says, look, if someone wants to put me on trial, bring it on, you know, and nothing would give me more pleasure than to be able to be present to help defend Jack in an honest to goodness trial, such as we've had since the Magna Carta. And it's madness that we're throwing that out of the door.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very important. We have two questions that are related, so maybe I'll put them together, and if people are able to address them. One is from Bessa Whitmore asking, other than the petition, what can we do to help? And then there's also a question from Suda Ali, who says that they're a part of a group of families in Trinidad and Tobago who are and have been advocating for the repatriation of our women and children from the camps in Syria since 2019. And they're wondering if there is currently any international group or organizations that we Trinidadians can liaise with. So kind of a question to put out there of are there broader groups that families could be liaising with, but also what beyond families could individuals be doing to help ensure that Canadians and who are the subject of today's call, but in general, that people are being repatriated and that their rights are being protected. I'll leave that open for anyone to answer. Matthew, you unmiked?
I unmiked, yes, indeed. In addition to being here today and signing the petition, we have a court hearing coming up in November, and it's absolutely critical that we build increasing opposition to this none is too many policy of the Canadian government. So one thing that you can do in the build up to that is speak to your member of parliament here and ask for a meeting with your MP along with Sally and myself, so that we can share this story. Because what we have found in meeting with the few MPs that we have met with is that they don't know what's going on. And when they do find out what's going on, they're actually quite outraged about it. As Heather McPherson said, there was a parliamentary committee that made the recommendation for repatriation, but that went nowhere. And that's literally something that no one knows about. So that would be a really important thing. We have a social media campaign called Selfies of Support. So everyone who is on this call today, if you'd like a follow-up, we'll send you information on how to do that. Again, the more that we can remind those watching that there are human beings involved here, not this kind of disaggregated thing out there that's this, you know, very weird passport photo, as we often see in the media. The more that we can humanize this issue, the better. If you belong to a labor organization, a faith group, can they write a letter with us to Melanie Joly to let them know that there is opposition to the failure to repatriate as well? And Sally, I'm wondering if you can speak to the international group.
Yes. Yes, there is an international WhatsApp group that Natascha and I are both part of, and that consists of family members as well as organisations who are or individuals within organisations who are involved in repatriation. And it's a bit of a support group as well. And so we share updates on what our governments are doing, how the court cases are doing, and, you know, repatriation numbers from countries, that sort of thing. So I see you're from Trinidad. If you wanted to leave your contact details with Tim at ICLMG, and then we can get you added onto the group, and hopefully you can benefit from you know, the chat that goes on between us.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Sally. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add on that? No? Okay. I do have a question from Jim Bronskill, a journalist with Canadian Press. And he's asking, what is the most recent thing that you have heard from Ottawa on federal efforts in the region? So I'll see if Matthew or Sally have an update on that. Sally, you're muted.
Yeah, I was trying to think of what federal efforts in the region could be. I know of none, I'm afraid. I don't know if anyone else knows of any. Matthew, do you have anything to say on that?
The only effort we've seen from the federal government is to take these families to court. And that's where they're putting their effort. They're putting their effort on preventing repatriation, not actually assisting it. And so they're essentially perpetuating the misery of those who are held in these prisons and camps, knowing that they are violating domestic and international law in doing so as well. So it's actually quite shameful. Nothing that we have seen indicates a willingness or an openness to bringing these Canadians home from global affairs. Nothing.
And maybe, thank you, Sally and Matthew, and maybe to add to that, based on the memo and the policy that we understand that Global Affairs Canada is following, it's unclear that any of the Canadian detainees would actually qualify for global affairs support at this point. So it's possible that there are developments that we don't know about in terms of the personal situation, but as far as we understand and as far as the latest information we have, that policy would in fact restrict the support for global affairs support for Canadians detained in northeastern Syria. We have a few other questions. We have a few hands that are up. So I'll go next to Bill Skidmore, who has a question.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. I was intrigued by Clive Stafford Smith's claim that Canada stopped arranging for passports and repatriation for citizens under pressure from the British government. And Clive, I was wondering, you also mentioned you have documentation for various aspects of the case. Could you give information of that either in the chat, a link, or perhaps send that information to Sally and Matthew, who could distribute it to the other people on their mailing lists?
Oh, well, Sally has all of that already, but you can certainly have it, and you can get it from me on my email address if you wanted. It's Clive, C-L-I-V-E, at 3dc, that's the number 3dc.org.uk. But yeah, I can share all the documentation of it. It's pretty straightforward.
Great, thank you. We have another question that's come in from an Italian journalist over Facebook. They are asking, we have the same issue in Europe. Do you have any partnerships with European NGOs on this issue of repatriation? So I guess we can say that we have Clive Stafford Smith from Reprieve here, and we also have Natascha Mikkelsen, who's working on this issue in Denmark. I don't know if either of you would be able to speak to, you know, who this journalist would best be, you know, put in touch with, or if you have any comments to make to their question.
Go ahead, Natascha. I mean, look, Natascha, you're going to answer that. Go ahead. Well, if Natascha's not, I will. I'm not actually with Reprieve anymore. I founded it, but I've set up a new charity now because we should all leave after 10 years. Reprieve is still doing a bunch of work on it. I am too with my new nonprofit, the 3D Center. There are different people in each country, and we've had some success. And you know, the Germans have particularly got a number of people back. And then we've got some allies in the United States too. The US, the American half of me says that it's just remarkable that for once we're not the bad guys on this. But you can email me and I'll happily put you in. This person, whoever it is, I don't do Facebook, I'm afraid, can certainly have my email and I'll put them in touch.
Excellent, thank you. And Natascha, did you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think it was pretty much that. I mean, we do cooperate a lot with different groups and RTC Sweden also, and yeah, I think we have a great cooperation between different countries and different people. So, but and people can reach us at both Facebook and Instagram and Twitter if they want to know more, so we can connect people.
Excellent, thank you very much. We have another question from, I hope I'm pronouncing this properly, but from Kamal Debussy. If you'd like to unmute, you can ask your question.
Thank you. Yes, my name's Kamal. I'm actually, I have family in the camp and my grandchildren in the camp as well. And I've been advocating on the other side of the world here in Australia for their return. But I actually wanted to, I mean, there's a lot of stuff to say on what everyone has said, but I actually wanted to make a comment on something that's sort of a theme that seems to be coming through. Almost a very medieval type of practice where people are having to go down to the court square and pledge allegiance to do things well and truly over beyond what a normal citizen has to do. People have to make statements in the public which somehow remorseful or appease public opinion in order just for governments to take the matter on notice and take it seriously. And it just, I just wanted to make an expression, if I could, that it feels like sort of this China-esque or medieval type of policy of having to confess your sins in public in order just to get some sort of due process undertaken. And you know, I take the note of what's happening in Trinidad and Tobago with, you know, families having to sign the agreement with the governments and families around the world saying they're prepared to cooperate and bend over backwards to support governments. It's something that we have to do, but I find this a very, very frustrating thing just to get governments to think about basic rights.
Thank you so much, Mr. Debussy. That was a very important comment. I don't know if any of the speakers would like to add anything or share their thoughts on that. Or if not, we'll go.
I wholeheartely agree with that. It was extremely well put by Kamal. That's been our experience as well. To the point that the few trials that have happened, notably the one with Lisa Smith in Ireland recently, the judge had to remind the court that Ms. Smith was entitled to presumption of innocence. So you know, we got to the point where all the detainees are considered guilty before they can be considered innocent, and they aren't given a chance to speak for themselves or prove their innocence. And so I want to thank Kamal for that remark, because medieval, I think, is an apt description.
Thank you, Sally. Now we have a question from Angela Leconte.
I just wanted to ask whether Amnesty International is involved in this, or whether you need to start getting them involved to heighten the awareness of this very important issue. Were you able to hear me?
Yes, thank you. Maybe just I can say in the Canadian context, we have been speaking with Amnesty International Canada. They've been doing some work on this issue in coordination a bit with Human Rights Watch Canada, who've been, I believe, more active. But in Canada, at least, they have, you know, been putting pressure on government officials. Matthew or Sally might have more to say, but Mozzam also has something to add about Amnesty International.
Sorry, it wasn't about Amnesty, but it was a point made by Kamal. And that is that my father was campaigning for me when I was in Guantanamo, held also without charge or trial, at a time when the United States was calling all of us without any evidence, without any due process, without any of the presumption of innocence that we've spoken about. They were calling us terrorists. And my father said something very simple, and something that Clive has repeated, and that is that if my son has committed a crime, then please take him to court and show him to be a criminal. Otherwise, if you're holding him without charge or trial, you're the criminal. And I think that this is such a profound thing, because at currently, with these men, women, and unbelievably children held in these camps in this condition, that we're so many years on. I think we've done so much with Guantanamo. We've managed to get the majority of the prisoners released over a period of 20 years. Now we're more than close to 6 years with these terrible, as I said, conditions that I think are worse than what we endured. So organizations, my own organization, Cage, we're very much connected to people who've been, who are relatives of those who are held still inside some of these camps. There are a large number of people from Britain that were there. And unfortunately, Britain, as Clive has said, have been the bad guys in all of this, because when Britain acts, everybody else as the mother country kind of follows. And the removal of citizenship has been one of the most profound things that the British government has done in order to shirk itself of its responsibility. And in that, it has, in doing so, it has had everybody frightened. Those who hail from other countries are worried that their nationalities also may be revoked just on the basis of their parents or grandparents coming from a country in Asia or Africa. So this is something to consider. And organizations have been up in arms, have been talking about it, but it's not at the stage where we, as a whole community in Britain and elsewhere, have been able to recognize, to say that this is really taking us back into the dark ages that Kamal had mentioned. So that's just what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And that really, you know, it really resonates with what we've been seeing here in Canada too, in terms of just the complete lack of support and the difficulty, and also building those networks and pushing this forward on something that, you know, as you say, it should be something that is understood at this point, that we cannot leave people in
Sorry,
these
yeah,
conditions.
just add one more thing, and that is, you know, I think,
yes, yeah.
And that is the Islamophobia, you see, is so palpable that people are afraid. It takes, and I have to say, Sally and her and John in the past have been almost the only ones who have come out publicly and spoken about, and look how they got targeted. You don't see anybody. You don't see any parents. There's barely anyone able to present themselves and feel comfortable and safe and secure in advocating simply for basic rights for their children or for their relatives. And that is because they know they will get targeted within the populist press, by the media, by politicians, and maybe even on the streets. So there is a level of Islamophobia that is not just street level, it's structural, it's at state level. And I don't know how it is in Canada, but here certainly people, disproportionately Muslims get stopped at airports under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000. And there are a whole host of legislations which target children in schools, for example, under Prevent or Countering Violent Extremism. So all of that puts us in a place where people can't even advocate for their own relatives because they're just too afraid.
Can I just add to what Mozzam is saying?
Definitely.
We have a situation where for the first time, there's been a really out front public campaign here in Canada. And in the last 4 months since we started our petition, we have almost 10,000 people who have signed it. And when you look at the comments on those petitions, you see that once people know the whole story of what's going on, they're outraged. They're absolutely appalled at what is going on. So I think at the grassroots level, there's a lot of people out there who are willing to support the detainees and their families in the fight for repatriation. It's getting organizations on board, and organizations right now, many of them are still behaving as if it's September the 12th, 2001, and they're still running in fear. And part of that is that institutional Islamophobia that Mozzam was talking about as well. So I think for those who are watching, one way to get involved is to share this story and to unashamedly share this story. And if there are family members watching, please get in touch with us and we'll work with you to ensure that your story gets out there in a safe way, in a way that protects you from any retribution or attacks. Because I think there's been this cone of silence over all of the detainees of the families up to date. And it's time that cone of silence comes off. And I think it takes a great deal of courage, as Sally has done in speaking out publicly over the last couple of months. We've seen a turning of the tide, because when people hear Sally share this story, not only of her own son and her family, but of all of the detainees, because Sally is in touch with many of the detainees and their loved ones, it is changing. But we need a push. And part of that push is informing our MPs about what's going on, sharing the petition and showing your face, saying, I am willing to be a voice for those whose voice is being suppressed actively by the Canadian government.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Oh, someone else?
Yes. May I just add? May I just add that recently we saw several heads of state assembled in Los Angeles with the heads of government meeting that just happened. And when I saw our Prime Minister in the company of the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of the United States and all these world leaders were there, I wish that with the advocacy deepening and widening, that we can target some of these international fora to be able to forward and to continue with the advocacy for the heads of government in these Western countries in particular, to be able to come to some understanding and position to revisit their hardline approach that they have. That's my view.
Thank you very much. We have two last questions here. So I'll go to Tazeen Hassan and then to Kamal Debussy again, and we'll take your questions very briefly. We're almost at 11:30, so we're going to wrap up soon. But if you can ask your questions briefly, and then we'll get some quick answers, and then any final thoughts from our speakers as well.
Hi, good morning. I just want to ask that as mentioned in the international mainstream media, that Kurdish authorities have repeatedly asked the government to take their citizens back. Is the place safe for journalists and for human rights advocates to visit? Are they allowing the human rights advocates and journalists to visit the Al-Hol jail? That's my question. I know that some of the journalists have visited, but are they, are they allowing it to everyone who wants to go, who want to visit, or the family members who want to visit?
Okay, thank you very much. And I believe we have a few people who can speak to that. We'll go to the next question just briefly though, and then we'll get responses to both. So Mr. Debussy.
Yes, certainly. It's just Kamal. I wanted to add to the point someone asked about Amnesty International, and I'll say about international groups as a whole. The issue has been was hugely unpopular to begin with. Large international agencies sort of fearing a repercussion to their donor base. Their advocacy was stalled, very, very tight, and there was not a lot of international support for the repatriation issue. Coupled with organizations trying to make the decisions as to whether they wanted to support in-country trials or trials back home. And clearly the international law has come out by saying that it's impossible to hold in-country trials. They don't have the ability, capacity, sophistication to do so. And it'd be done by a non-state actor. So the international communities have been a bit slow, in my opinion, to respond overall. And Amnesty is in that boat. Certainly at the moment they're supportive, but they were slow off the mark. Can I also underscore the issue about families speaking up? We have led the campaign in Australia. Families have been front and center. We had a long format 2019 on the ABC, and we have had some concessions. And we've had the governments here commit to, when repatriation takes place, of the mother and children. They have no interest in separating children from the mothers. We have established a support program for when they do return to protect the women, children, when they come back from too much interference. And we've got concessions to be able to send money and funds to family members that are overseas in northeast Syria. So there have been some concessions, but a family member speaking and who is capable to deal with the media goes a long way in your support in the case in international arenas.
Thank you very much, Kamal. I'll turn it over to our speakers. Does anybody have a comment on the safety question for human rights advocates or for journalists who are visiting the camps? And as well, if you have anything you'd like to add to what Kamal has said or any closing thoughts, I'd welcome you to. I think you can all are able to unmute on your own, so you can unmute and share your thoughts as well.
I could add on this. I have been to the prison camps and in northeast Syria, and also visit the prison in northeast Syria 7-8 times. I think I've been there, both as a journalist the first 2 times, and then 3 times, and then 5 times as an NGO. And my experience is that it's very difficult to get there if you're family members. We travel with a mother and a sister of one woman, 2 children in Al Hol camp that was imprisoned in Al Hol camp. And we had a lot of, it was very complicated to get them, get all the papers and to travel with them there. And it was only because we were doing a documentary film at that time. And as an NGO, it has been difficult, but more difficult than being a journalist. But since we also have a media department in our NGO, we had, it was more easy to go down there. So it's, yeah, there's a lot of things that you have to, a lot of, application you have to make, and it's not so easy to go there. But I think, yeah, it's very important to travel down there and to see how it is. So.
Thank you, Natascha. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add on that? Matthew?
Well, yeah, dozens of countries have been able to repatriate thousands of their citizens. It happens all the time. So this notion that this is a no-go zone or that it's too dangerous, as Clive has said, who has been there himself many times, is bogus. So that is not an excuse that can be used. And journalists have been, as Natascha was saying, they have been able to access those camps. I recently spoke to a journalist who was in Rojava, you know, and I asked her, you know, are you safe and comfortable walking the streets? She says, oh yeah, no problem. You know, the other thing I think that's really critical is that we not allow governments to play divide and rule. And they play divide and rule based on the Islamophobic notion that male adult Muslims are somehow the most dangerous group of people. We are not campaigning only for one segment of Canadians to come home. We are campaigning for the adult men, the adult women, and all children to come home, because regardless of your gender, regardless of your nationality, of your religion, of your political belief, you're a Canadian citizen and you have that right to come home.
Thank you, Matthew. Do any of the other presenters have any final words you'd like to share? And if not, we'll wrap things up.
I'll simply say this, that it's really that, you know, to at least look at how things are in the UK. I think in the UK we've been really cowed down in terms of communities, in terms of relatives, in terms of campaigns and so forth. So even the fact that this is happening from Canada, I know that the Canadian government clearly has shirked its responsibilities and is not stepping up to the mark. But here in the UK, I think it's even worse. Just even an event like this in the UK on this subject is so much harder to manage, to maintain, precisely because of that, the arms of the government that are so powerfully frightening people into not advocating for something that is a basic right. So if I could say anything positive about this event, it's that it's a positive step, and I hope that it grows in both primarily in Canada but internationally also, so that other voices join. When you hear the voices of Kamal from Australia, for example, and the things they've managed, even small concessions, they're all little steps. Nothing, you can't win any of these battles in one go. It is step by step. It's attrition, and that's something that I've learned from my father's legacy when he campaigned for me when I was in Guantanamo.
Thank you very much, Mozzam, and it's really an honor to have you here with us for this event. And we really do hope that this is part of of the steps forward to really, shedding a light on this issue, bringing groups together, inspiring, some of those groups, as others have said, who have not been as active on this, to speak up, and to also provide a space where these stories can be shared and shared safely and in a way that speaks to the need for immediate government action, that speaks to the unjust nature and the lack of humanity in government's actions. And that, as so many of you, have said this morning, that calls out the systemic Islamophobia and the racism that's really at the heart of this issue. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here with us today. It's really been an honor to host you all, and we look forward to sharing this on Facebook, on YouTube, and sharing with all of you by email so that it can be passed along as well to others. We hope that this sparks some more conversations and more importantly, action. So thank you again, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.